All right, here are the steps to comparing fractions. Whenever you compare fractions, it's easiest to do that if you have a common denominator. So your first step is to get a common denominator. And to find the common denominator, we are going to multiply the two denominators that you have, and that's going to be your new denominator. And then you're going to use that new denominator to make equivalent fractions. And I underline the D to help you remember that D is for denominator and D is for down. The denominator is the number down on the bottom. Once you have made your equivalent fractions, then you can compare your numerators. So here's the first example that I did. I'm going to work this one out on paper so you can follow along. So I'm going to show you these steps. So we have 3/4 compared with 2/3. So your first step is to get a common denominator. So step 1, if you follow along on your notes, it says get a common denominator. So we're going to multiply 4 times 3. We're going to multiply this denominator times this denominator to get our new denominator. 4 times 3 is 12. So our new denominator is going to be 12. So now, step 2, I'm going to make equivalent fractions with my new denominator. So I'm going to make a fraction that's equivalent to 3/4 with my new denominator of 12. And I'm going to make a new fraction that is equivalent to 2/3 with my new denominator that is 12. So we're going to use the steps that we have used in the past to make equivalent fractions. You're going to ask yourself, what can I do to 4 to get to 12? When it's getting bigger, you know you're going to multiply. And we already know that we multiplied this denominator times this denominator to make 12. So we multiplied this 4 times 3. So I know I need to multiply times 3. And remember, whatever you do to the denominator, you have to do to your numerator. So if I multiply the bottom times 3, I multiply the top times 3. So then I'm going to multiply my numerator times 3 to get my new numerator on my equivalent fraction. 3 times 3 is 9. You do the exact same steps on the other side. Ask yourself, how can you get from 3 to 12? They're getting bigger, so you know you're going to multiply, and we know we multiplied this denominator times this denominator, so I know I have to multiply 3 times 4 to get 12. And whatever you do to the bottom, you do the same thing to the top. These are proportional to each other. That means if this one doubles, this one doubles. If this one multiplies by 4, this one multiplies by 4. So 2 times 4 is 8. Now I can use this fraction and this fraction to compare. Since this one is the same as this, and this one is the same as this, I'll know whichever one is bigger, the fraction that matches is also the bigger fraction. So if you compare 9/12 to 8/12, your denominators are the same, so you just look at your numerators. 9 is bigger, so that means 9/12 is larger than 8/12. And since 9/12 is the same as 3/4, that means 3/4 is bigger than 2/3. You can think about it as the bigger one gets 2 dots and the little one gets 1 dot. Or you can just make your symbol 3/4 is greater than 2/3. Let's do a couple more examples together. So first we are going to compare 3/4 with 4/6. So my first step is to get a common denominator. So I'm going to multiply 4 times 6, which is 24. So I know my new denominator is going to be 24. And then I'm going to use the steps to find my numerator so that I can compare my fractions. You have to say, what can you do to 4 to get to 24? Well, 4 times what makes 24? We know it has to be multiplied because it's getting bigger. If you get bigger, it's going to multiply. If it's getting smaller, it's going to divide. And since we multiplied 4 times 6 to make 24, we know it's going to be times 6. And remember, whatever you do to the bottom, you do to the top. So then I'm going to multiply the top times 6. So then you multiply your numerator times 6 to get your new numerator. 3 times 6 is 18. You're going to do the same steps on the other fraction. How do you get from 6 to 24? 6 times what makes 24? Well, 6 times 4 makes 24. So I know I need to multiply the top times 4. And then you multiply your numerator times 4. 4 times 4 is 16. Now you can compare these two fractions. What's bigger, 18 over 24 or 16 over 24? Since the denominators are the same, you can look at your numerators. 18 is bigger, which means this is bigger. So 3/4 is greater than 4/6. I like to circle which one's bigger just kind of to help point out that I get the sign the right way. So it wants to point to the small one. It's like it's grabbing the big one. You're saying 3/4 is greater than 4/6. Remember when it looks like an L that's kind of been leaned on, it's the less than. L is for less than. And if it's not the L, then it's the greater than symbol. Let's do another one together. We're going to compare 1/4 with 5/8. I'm going to show you another little trick. So if I have 1/4 and I have 5/8, you can always use the trick that I've just shown you where you get an equivalent, a common denominator and make equivalent fractions. But sometimes you will be able to compare them to benchmark fractions. So like you can say 0, 1/2, 1/2. So if I look at 1/4 and I think about 1/2, is that more than a half or less than a half? Look at your denominator and think, what is half of 4? Well, 2 is half of 4. So if I have 2/4, that's the same as 1/2. Since I have less than 2, this is smaller than 1/2. And over here, if I look at this one, if I think about half of 8 is what? 4 is half of 8. And 5 is more than 4/8. So 5/8 is more than 1/2. So if I know that one of them is smaller than a half and the other one is more than a half, then I can already tell which one is bigger. The one that is more than a half is bigger than the one that is less than 1/2. 1/4 is less than 5/8. Now you can still use the other strategy. It works too, but this is just a little bit different, and it will save you a few steps if you understand that. And if you don't, try it the other way and then look at it again this way, and that will help you, and eventually you'll get to that level. All right, let's look at another one. I'm going to show you another trick. This trick doesn't always work. 3/4 to 2/8. So sometimes this fraction denominator will be a factor of this denominator. That means I can multiply this number times something to make this number. So think about it. Can I multiply 4 times something to make 8? Well, yeah, we can multiply 4 times 2 to make 8. So I could let my common denominator be 8. That's called LCD, or least common denominator. And you're going to get to that step or that level eventually, but right now you can always multiply your two denominators together to make a common denominator. You don't have to use the smallest denominator possible. So if I can multiply 4 times 2 to get 8, then you can multiply your top times 2. Remember, you want to do the same thing to both numerator and denominator. So 4 times 2 makes the 8. 3 times 2 makes 6. So now I can compare 6/8 with 2/8. 6/8 is bigger than 2/8. 6 is larger than 2, so I know that fraction is larger, that one is smaller. Bigger one gets 2 dots, little one gets 1 dot, and then you can connect those. Now you could have also used the half strategy on this. Half of 4 is 2. That one's more than a half. Half of 8 is 4. That's less than a half. So you could have used that on this too. All right, let's do another example together. We'll do one that's like this again. Let's do 1/4 compared with 5/8. Oh wait, we already did that. 1/4 with, let's say 5/12. So you can just check, is your smaller denominator something that I can multiply to make 12? Can I multiply something times 4 to make 12? Well, yeah, I can do 4 times 3. So I'm going to make a new fraction with a denominator of 12, and then I don't have to do anything over here, and they'll have common denominators because this is a 12 and this one can be a 12. How can you get from 4 to 12? 4 times what makes 12? 4 times 3 makes 12. So I can multiply my top times 3 also. Remember, whatever you do to one, you do to the other. 1 times 3 is 3. So then you can compare 3/12 with 5/12. 5/12 is bigger, 1/4 is smaller, so 1/4 is less than 5/12. Here's another example. Let's do 2/5 and 3/8. So I can't multiply 5 times something to make 8. So we are going to make a new fraction with common denominator. If I look at the half, this one is smaller than a half, and this one is smaller than a half. Half of 5 would be $2.50. So that's smaller than 2.5, and half of 8 is 4, so that one's smaller than a half. So I can't use that strategy here either. So we're going to make a new fraction with a common denominator. 5 times 8 is 40. And then you're going to multiply. How can I get from 5 to 40? Let's multiply by 8. I'm multiplying by this number here, so then essentially I'm just multiplying the 8 times the 2, which is 16. And then to get from 8 to 40, I'm multiplying my 5 times 8 to make 40. So then I'm going to multiply 5 times 3 to get my numerator. 5 times 3 is 15. And then I can compare these. 16 is bigger than 15. Since they have the same denominator, I just compare my numerator. So this one is bigger. So 2/5 is greater than 3/8.